Hey there, and welcome to True Scary Stories. Before we dive in, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling us where you're from and what time you're watching. That helps YouTube know you love creepy stories, and it'll keep sending more your way.
7 True Scary Alaska FBI Horror Stories. Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're new here, I tell true scary stories. Stories sent in by real people, cases pulled from documented reports, and incidents that most people never hear about. Tonight's video is a little different. Tonight, we're going north. Way north. We're going to Alaska, a place so vast, so remote, and so unforgiving that things can happen out there that nobody ever finds out about. The FBI field office in Anchorage covers more land than most countries. And in that darkness, in those frozen forests and empty coastlines, some things have happened that the agents who worked these cases still think about at night. These are 7 true scary Alaska FBI horror stories. Story 1. The Cabin on the Kuskokwim. It's late October in rural western Alaska. The kind of cold that doesn't just chill you, it gets inside you. The sky goes dark by 4 in the afternoon, and when there's no moon, there is absolutely no light. Nothing. Just endless black wilderness in every direction. A man named Dale had been living out there for almost 2 years. He was a former commercial fisherman from Oregon who had decided to go off-grid. He had a small cabin about 40 miles from the nearest village on the banks of the Kuskokwim River. No phone, no internet, just a shortwave radio and his dogs. His nearest neighbor, a Yupik elder named Henry, would check on him by snowmobile every couple of weeks during winter. Henry had done it for over a year, just making sure the smoke was still coming out of the chimney. That was the signal. Smoke means alive. In the second week of November, Henry made his usual run out to Dale's cabin. It was about a 9-mile ride through dense spruce forest. Cold, quiet, just the hiss of the snowmobile in the trees. When Henry got within sight of the cabin, he slowed down. No smoke. He told himself maybe the fire had just died down. Maybe Dale was out checking his trap lines. He pulled up to the cabin and cut the engine. And then he heard it. The dogs were whimpering. Not barking, not howling, whimpering. He said it was the kind of sound a dog makes when it's terrified and doesn't know what to do. All 4 of them were huddled at the far end of their enclosure, pressed against each other, shaking. Henry called out for Dale. Nothing. He approached the cabin door. It was closed, not locked. Dale never locked it. He pushed it open. The inside was undisturbed, everything in its place. The wood stove was cold. The coffee mug on the table still had coffee in it, frozen solid. Dale's rifle was still on the rack above the door. His boots were beside the bed. His coat was hanging on the hook. Dale was gone. No footprints in the fresh snow outside. Not a sign of struggle, not a blood. Just gone. Like he had simply ceased to exist inside that cabin while everything he owned stayed behind. Henry got on his shortwave radio and contacted the village. They reached Alaska State Troopers, and because of the circumstances, the isolation, the missing person, some things Henry noticed inside the cabin that he didn't describe publicly, the FBI field office in Anchorage was brought in within 48 hours. 2 agents flew in by bushplane. One of them, a woman named Agent Calloway, had spent 8 years working missing persons in Alaska. She had seen a lot. What she said about Dale's cabin was this. Something about it made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. She couldn't explain it logically. The cabin was cold and still and completely normal, except for one thing. On the back wall, behind the wood stove, scratched into the logs, not carved deeply, just scratched, like with a fingernail, were the words, "It was already inside." Agent Calloway said she didn't know if Dale had written that, or if someone or something else had. The handwriting couldn't be matched because Dale's family had no samples to compare it to. The search operation covered a 12-mile radius for 5 days. Helicopters, ground teams, canine units. They found nothing. Not a single boot print, not a piece of clothing, not a body. Dale was added to Alaska's long list of missing persons. That list, by the way, is one of the highest per capita in the entire country. But here's what sticks with me about this one. When the FBI processed the cabin, they found something under Dale's mattress. a journal. Most of it was routine, daily temperatures, fishing notes, what the dogs ate. But the last 3 entries were different. Entry 1. Something has been circling the cabin at night. Dogs won't stop watching the tree line. Can't see anything in the dark. Entry 2. Didn't sleep. Kept hearing breathing outside the east wall. Too slow to be wind, too rhythmic to be an animal. Entry 3, the last one, dated the morning before Henry found the cabin empty. It knocked on the door last night, 3 times, slow. I didn't open it. God help me, I should have. The case remains open.
Story 2. The Girl from Port Hayden. Port Hayden is a tiny village on the Alaska Peninsula. It sits between the mountains and the Bering Sea, and when the wind comes off that water in January, it will cut through anything. Not the kind of cold that makes you uncomfortable, the kind of cold that makes you understand very quickly that you are fragile, that the land out there doesn't care about you, that it never did. The population of Port Hayden is under 100 people. Most of them know each other. Most of them are related. There are no strangers in Port Hayden, which is exactly why what happened is so deeply unsettling. Because in a village that small, in the dead of an Alaskan winter, a stranger has nowhere to hide. And yet, something was there. So when a 17-year-old girl named Vera disappeared from her home on a Tuesday night in January, the whole village knew about it within hours. That's how it works in a place like that. Word doesn't travel through phones or social media. It travels door to door, face to face, in the dark, in the cold, because that's the only way there is. Vera's aunt, the woman she lived with, said she had gone to bed at 9:30 and was simply gone by morning. No note, no signs of a struggle. The window in her bedroom was closed and latched from the inside. The front door had been locked. Her aunt had checked it before going to sleep herself, but in the morning it was unlocked. Not open, just unlocked. Vera's phone was on the kitchen table. Her coat was on the hook by the door. Her boots, her only winter boots, were still on the mat. That last part is what got people. You do not walk out into an Alaskan January night without your boots. You do not survive it. The temperature that night had dropped to -14 degrees. The wind off the Bering Sea was clocking at 20 miles an hour. Whatever had taken Vera out of that house, she hadn't chosen it. She hadn't packed, hadn't planned, hadn't dressed for it. She had simply been removed. The village did its own search immediately. They checked the beach, the tundra, the handful of dirt roads that wound between the houses. They split into groups and walked in lines across the open ground as the sky went gray with morning. Nothing. No tracks. No Vera. Alaska state troopers flew in the next day. The airstrip was barely usable, a thin strip of frozen gravel with crosswinds bad enough that the pilot had to make 2 attempts before landing. Then, because Vera was a minor, and because of Port Hayden's location in a federally recognized tribal community, the FBI's Anchorage division was notified. A request was filed, and within 36 hours of Vera's disappearance, Agent Reyes was on a bush plane headed southwest into one of the most remote corners of Alaska. Agent Reyes had been with the FBI for 14 years at that point. He had worked missing persons cases all over the state. He had flown into fishing villages and mining camps and off-grid homesteads. He was not a man who rattled easily. He described Port Hayden as one of the most isolated places he had ever been sent to. No road access. You fly in or you don't come. In winter, even the airstrip can become unusable for days at a time. A bad storm rolls in off the water, and you are simply stuck, cut off from everything. He said the wind there was a constant presence, always howling, always pushing at you, like the land itself was trying to move you along, like it wanted you somewhere else. He set up a small command post in the village community building and began interviewing residents that first afternoon. Most of what he heard was what you'd expect: shock, grief, confusion. Nobody had seen anything that night. Nobody had heard anything unusual. But on the second day, something changed. An older man came to speak with him. His name was Joseph.
He was one of the village elders, a man who had lived in Port Hayden his entire life, who had seen it through hard winters and harder losses. He was not the type to come forward with something unless he was certain it mattered. Agent Reyes said he could tell just from the way Joseph sat down across from him that whatever he was about to say had been weighing on him since the moment Vera was reported missing. Joseph told him that Vera had come to see him about 2 weeks before she disappeared. She had shown up to his door in the early evening, unannounced. He said she looked like she had been frightened for several days, not fresh fear, but the kind that had settled in and made itself at home. Dark circles, tight jaw, eyes that kept moving to the window. She told Joseph she had been seeing someone on the beach. Not during the day, at night, late, after midnight, sometimes closer to 2 in the morning. She had been having trouble sleeping, and from her bedroom window she had a partial view of the shoreline. Several times over the course of a week, she had looked out that window and seen a figure standing on the beach, always in the same spot, maybe 60 yards from the water's edge, just standing there in the dark and the wind, like the cold didn't bother it at all. And something about the shape of it, she struggled to explain it to Joseph, and he struggled to explain it to Agent Reyes. Something about the way it was shaped made her feel like it wasn't right, like the proportions were slightly off, like the way it stood was just a little too still. She went to look the next night. It was there again. Same spot, same stillness. And the third night, same spot. But this time, when she looked out the window at it, she had the overwhelming feeling that it knew she was looking, that it had been waiting for her to look. She didn't know why she felt that. She just did. And it scared her so badly that she backed away from the window and didn't sleep the rest of the night. That's when she went to Joseph. Joseph took her seriously enough to go check the beach himself the following evening. He walked the shoreline at the approximate time Vera had described, stood in the spot she had identified, and looked back toward the village. He stayed out there for close to an hour in the cold. He found nothing. No footprints in the sand, though he acknowledged that a full day of wind could have erased them. No marks, no Vera. Alaska state troopers flew in the next day. The airstrip was barely usable, a thin strip of frozen gravel with crosswinds bad enough that the pilot had to make 2 attempts before landing. Then, because Vera was a minor, and because of Port Hayden's location in a federally recognized tribal community, the FBI's Anchorage division was notified. A request was filed, and within 36 hours of Vera's disappearance, Agent Reyes was on a bush plane headed southwest into one of the most remote corners of Alaska. Agent Reyes had been with the FBI for 14 years at that point. He had worked missing persons cases all over the state. He had flown into fishing villages and mining camps and off-grid homesteads. He was not a man who rattled easily. He described Port Hayden as one of the most isolated places he had ever been sent to. No road access. You fly in or you don't come. In winter, even the airstrip can become unusable for days at a time. A bad storm rolls in off the water, and you are simply stuck, cut off from everything. He said the wind there was a constant presence, always howling, always pushing at you, like the land itself was trying to move you along, like it wanted you somewhere else. He set up a small command post in the village community building and began interviewing residents that first afternoon. Most of what he heard was what you'd expect: shock, grief, confusion. Nobody had seen anything that night. Nobody had heard anything unusual. But on the second day, something changed. An older man came to speak with him. His name was Joseph. He was one of the village elders, a man who had lived in Port Hayden his entire life, who had seen it through hard winters and harder losses. He was not the type to come forward with something unless he was certain it mattered. Agent Reyes said he could tell just from the way Joseph sat down across from him that whatever he was about to say had been weighing on him since the moment Vera was reported missing. Joseph told him that Vera had come to see him about 2 weeks before she disappeared. She had shown up to his door in the early evening, unannounced. He said she looked like she had been frightened for several days, not fresh fear, but the kind that had settled in and made itself at home. Dark circles, tight jaw, eyes that kept moving to the window. She told Joseph she had been seeing someone on the beach. Not during the day, at night, late, after midnight, sometimes closer to 2 in the morning. She had been having trouble sleeping, and from her bedroom window she had a partial view of the shoreline. Several times over the course of a week, she had looked out that window and seen a figure standing on the beach, always in the same spot, maybe 60 yards from the water's edge, just standing there in the dark and the wind, like the cold didn't bother it at all. And something about the shape of it. She struggled to explain it to Joseph, and he struggled to explain it to Agent Reyes. Something about the way it was shaped made her feel like it wasn't right, like the proportions were slightly off, like the way it stood was just a little too still. She went to look the next night. It was there again. Same spot, same stillness. And the third night, same spot. But this time, when she looked out the window at it, she had the overwhelming feeling that it knew she was looking, that it had been waiting for her to look. She didn't know why she felt that. She just did. And it scared her so badly that she backed away from the window and didn't sleep the rest of the night. That's when she went to Joseph. Joseph took her seriously enough to go check the beach himself the following evening. He walked the shoreline at the approximate time Vera had described, stood in the spot she had identified, and looked back toward the village. He stayed out there for close to an hour in the cold. He found nothing. No footprints in the sand, though he acknowledged that a full day of wind could have erased them. No marks. No signs that anyone had been standing there. He went home and told himself it had been her imagination. The dark plays tricks on you in Alaska. The wind moves things. Shadows do things they shouldn't. He told Vera not to worry. He told Agent Reyes he would regret that for the rest of his life. After hearing Joseph's account, Agent Reyes refocused the search. He pulled the coastline teams away from the area directly around the village and pushed them further out in both directions. He wanted to know what was on that beach. For 3 days, they found nothing significant. Cold sand, driftwood, the debris that the Bering Sea throws up in winter. The wind made everything miserable. The sky stayed low and gray. The days were short, barely 6 hours of usable light. On day 4, a 2-man team working about 2 miles north of the village radioed in. They had found something. Tucked into a rocky alcove where the beach curved against a low cliff, sheltered from the wind, invisible from both directions unless you were walking right along the waterline, they had found a structure. Not a building, not a shelter in any conventional sense. It was low to the ground, roughly the size of a large dog kennel, constructed from driftwood pieces lashed together with old rope. Woven into the framework were what appeared to be animal bones, smooth, pale, bleached by time. Bird bones mostly, Agent Reyes said later, but some that the forensics team couldn't identify without further analysis. The structure was recent. The wood hadn't weathered, and the cut surfaces on the lashed pieces still showed tool marks that hadn't been worn down by the elements. Someone had built this within the last few weeks. The inside of the structure was packed with objects, personal items, small things, a child's hair clip, a man's wallet, empty of cash and ID, but still holding a library card from a town 200 miles away, a bracelet made of braided cord, a single earring, a folded piece of paper with writing on it in a language the agents couldn't immediately identify, a small carved figurine, wooden, worn smooth from handling. When investigators began running these items against records, they found something that made the room go quiet. 2 of the items matched property belonging to people who had been reported missing from communities along the Alaska Peninsula, one from 6 years ago, one from 4. Both cases were still open. Both individuals had never been found. The other items couldn't be matched to any report. That either meant the people they belonged to had never been reported missing, which happens more often than most people realize, especially in isolated communities,
or that they had been taken from people who were still out there somewhere, unaware. Vera's jacket was at the back of the structure, folded neatly, pressed against the far wall like it had been placed there with intention, not dropped, not discarded, placed. The forensics team processed the entire structure. No fingerprints on any surface, no skin cells, no saliva, nothing that could produce a DNA profile. The only biological material recovered was hair. Long, dark hair woven into the rope throughout the structure, not gathered in one place, but threaded through it deliberately, strand by strand, as though it had been worked in during construction. The hair was consistent with Vera's description. The DNA confirmed it several weeks later. Vera was never found. Agent Reyes remained in Port Haydn for 9 days total before weather and resources forced a scaling back of the search. He flew out on a gray afternoon with the wind at 30 knots, looking down at the coast through the plane window, at that narrow strip of beach between the village and the water. He said in a later recorded interview that the structure had felt deliberately arranged, not like a survival shelter, not like somewhere a person had hidden or camped, like something that had been built for a purpose that had nothing to do with human need, like an offering or a collection. He said he had worked over 200 missing persons cases in Alaska over the course of his career. He had seen things that were tragic, things that were violent, things that were senseless. He had closed cases and he had failed to close cases, and he had learned to carry both. But when he was asked about Port Haydn specifically, about Vera, he paused for a long time before answering. He said, "Most cases you want the answer, even when the answer is bad, because the answer means it's over. It means you understand what happened. With this one, I didn't want to know. For the first time in my career, I genuinely did not want to find out what took that girl, because whatever built that structure on the beach wasn't operating on logic I could follow. And I think, somewhere in the back of my head, I was afraid that if I understood it, really understood it, it would know that I did." He paused again. He said, "Some things in Alaska don't like being understood. They like being invisible." And Vera saw it. She looked out her window in the dark, and she saw it standing there. And I think that's what started all of it. The case remains open. The structure was photographed, documented, and then dismantled by the forensics team for evidence collection. But before they broke it down, one of the technicians, a woman who had worked field forensics for 11 years, took a long look at it in the thin winter light and said something that nobody on the team forgot. She said, "Count the bones." They counted them. There were 17. Arranged in the framework in no particular pattern that anyone could identify at the time, just distributed throughout the structure, tied in with the driftwood. 17 bones. Vera was 17 years old. Nobody said anything out loud on the beach that day, but Agent Reyes wrote it in his case notes that night, and he put a star next to it, and below it, in the margin, in handwriting that was slightly less steady than the rest of the page, he wrote 2 words. It knew.
Story 3. Something in the Mine. In the early 2000s, a small private mining operation was running in the hills outside of Chicken, Alaska. If you've never heard of Chicken, that's okay. Most people haven't. It's a tiny, unincorporated community in the eastern interior, deep in the kind of wilderness that makes you feel genuinely small. Bears, moose, spruce forest as far as you can see, and gold. There's been gold in those hills since the 1800s, and people have been chasing it ever since. In summer, a few hundred tourists pass through for recreational panning, but when the season ends and the temperatures drop, the population shrinks down to almost nothing. Just a handful of people and the wilderness pressing in from every direction. This particular mine employed 7 men. They were after placer gold in a hillside shaft about 3 miles from the nearest road, which itself was barely more than a gravel track. Getting there meant a long drive through dense forest and then a hike in with equipment on your back. It was remote, deliberately so. The kind of operation that runs quiet, stays off the radar, and just does the work. The crew boss was a man named Roy. He was in his late 50s, a veteran miner who had worked Alaska's ground for over 30 years. Hard ground, dangerous ground, ground that had killed men he had known. He understood the risks of this kind of work better than almost anyone. He was methodical, calm, and practical in the way that people become after decades of doing something difficult. He was not the type to get spooked. Every single person who knew him said exactly that, both before and after what happened. The incident started in late August, about 6 weeks into the season. The crew had been pushing deeper into the shaft, maybe 60 feet in by that point, chipping through solid rock, reinforcing as they went, following the gold seam into the hillside. It was on a Tuesday afternoon, right at the end of the shift, when the bit broke through. Not into more rock, into open space. Roy described it as a natural void, a pocket in the rock that had been sitting there undisturbed, sealed up inside the earth for God knows how long. He estimated it was about 10 feet wide and 15 feet deep. When he held his helmet light up to the opening and looked in, he said it was perfectly dark, the kind of dark that feels thick, the kind that doesn't want your light inside it. He said 2 things happened the moment they broke through, and they happened at exactly the same time. The temperature dropped, not gradually, sharply, like walking from a warm room into a freezer. Every man in the shaft felt it simultaneously, and all of their helmet lights flickered, together, one single pulse of darkness and then back on. No electrical explanation. The wiring on their helmets was independent, each one running off its own separate battery pack. There was no shared circuit that could have caused them all to flicker in unison. The men laughed it off. Miners are superstitious by nature, but they're also practical, and the shaft was still standing, and the gold was still there. They marked the void, finished the shift, and went back to camp. But that night, something changed. Roy described it as a pressure. Not physical, not like a headache, more like a low, constant unease that sat behind your eyes and didn't go away. Like the feeling you get when you're being watched, except it didn't come from any direction. It was just present. He noticed it in himself, and then, quietly, without anyone bringing it up first, 2 of the other men mentioned the same thing over dinner. They couldn't shake the feeling, couldn't explain it, just sat with it through the night. Nobody slept particularly well. 3 days later, a younger miner, a guy named Brett, early 20s, first full season in Alaska, came to Roy before the morning shift and said he wasn't going back into the shaft. Roy had seen men refuse before. It happened. The enclosed space, the darkness, the physical danger, some people hit a wall. He wasn't cruel about it. He asked Brett what was wrong. Brett was quiet for a moment and then said he'd been having the same dream every night since they broke through into the void. He wouldn't describe the dream in detail. He seemed genuinely unwilling to put words to it, but he said one thing clearly. He said there was something in that mine, something that had been there for a very long time, something that was waiting, and he said it was starting to recognize their faces. Roy sent Brett back to chicken and told the rest of the crew it was just nerves. He believed that at the time. Then things got worse. A few mornings after Brett left, Roy went to do his standard pre-shift inspection of the shaft, checking the supports, looking for any shifts in the rock, making sure nothing had changed overnight. He did it every morning, routine. That morning, it was not routine. Someone had been at the workface. The tools were moved, not scattered, moved deliberately. The drill was set to one side, the pry bars were stacked in the wrong order, and the rock face itself bore new marks, not from any tool they had on site. Roy knew every tool they had and what it each produced in the rock. These marks were different, deeper in some places, almost delicate in others, running in patterns he couldn't identify. And in the dirt floor of the void, in that black pocket of open space inside the hill, there were indentations. Not footprints, he was clear about that. Not any shape he recognized. Just pressure marks in the soft dirt, like something had been sitting in there, or standing. Something's weight was distributed in a way that didn't match any person or animal Roy could think of. 4 distinct impressions, irregularly placed, deep enough to show significant mass. He stood at the opening to the void for a long time, holding his light up, looking at those marks. He said it was the first moment in 30 years of working mines that he seriously considered walking away. He didn't. He called the state mining office instead, hoping for a logical answer. They sent an inspector out within 48 hours. The inspector examined the shaft, checked the structural integrity, reviewed the marks Roy had photographed. He found nothing wrong with the shaft itself, cleared them to continue, wrote it up as probably a bear that had gotten in overnight, which Roy knew was nonsense because the shaft entrance was gated and there were no bear tracks anywhere near the site. They went back to work, but the feeling in the camp had changed. The men were quieter. They moved faster in the shaft, did their work, and got out. Nobody lingered. On the 5th night after the void was opened, a miner named Cal woke up around 2 in the morning and walked to the outhouse at the edge of camp. He never came back. By morning, when Roy noticed his bunk empty and his breakfast untouched, they searched the camp. They found nothing, no signs of struggle, no trail. The outhouse door was open and empty. That's when the FBI got involved, not because of the mine specifically, but because a missing person in a federal resource area triggers federal jurisdiction. 2 agents flew in the next morning by bushplane. They searched the area systematically and found Cal's flashlight at the entrance to the mine shaft sitting there, right at the threshold where the darkness starts, still on, pointed straight into the tunnel. Cal was found 6 days later, 11 miles away, deep in the spruce forest, alive, but barely. He was severely hypothermic, disoriented, and physically unable to explain how he had gotten there. His boots were worn through, his hands were cut up. He had no memory of leaving camp. His last clear memory was walking out of the mine shaft the previous afternoon, before dinner, before dark, hours before he would have gone to the outhouse. He lost an entire night and then 6 days, and he couldn't account for a single minute of it. When the FBI agents asked him whether he had seen or heard anyone near the mine, Cal was quiet for a long time. Then he said, and this was recorded in the case file, word for word, "I didn't see anyone. I heard breathing. And then there was a long time where I wasn't me anymore." He couldn't elaborate. He didn't seem to be withholding anything. He genuinely appeared to not know what those words meant himself, like they had come from somewhere he couldn't access. He was airlifted to a hospital in Fairbanks, treated for exposure, and released after a few days. Physically, he recovered, but people who knew him before and after said something had changed. He was quieter, jumpier. He'd stop mid-sentence sometimes, like he was listening for something. He quit mining before the end of the season, moved south within the year, cut contact with most of the people he had worked with. He never talked about what happened to anyone. Roy shut the mine down voluntarily 1 week after Cal was found. He pulled the crew, packed the equipment, and filed his shutdown report with the state. At the bottom of the form, in the section marked Additional Notes, where most miners write something brief and technical, Roy wrote a full paragraph. It read, "I have worked in the ground my whole life. I know what natural feels like. I know the difference between rock and gas and pressure and all the things that can go wrong underground. I know what an animal does and what a person does and what the earth does when it shifts. I know all of that. Whatever is in that shaft is not natural. It was there before we came, and it was aware of us from the beginning. I will not send men in there again." The shaft entrance was sealed with poured concrete the following week.
The void, that black...
Story 4. The Ferry Passenger. The Alaska Marine Highway is a ferry system that connects coastal communities, some of the most isolated towns in the world. These ferries travel hundreds of miles through narrow channels, past glaciers and mountain ranges, stopping at villages that have no road access. For a lot of passengers, the ferry is the only way in or out. This story takes place on a run from Juneau to Ketchikan. It's a long trip, over 30 hours. Passengers book cabins or sleep in recliner chairs in the solarium. The crew numbers about 20. In the shoulder season, passenger loads are light, sometimes only a few dozen people on a ship that can carry hundreds. A crew member named Tate, who had worked the ferries for about 6 years, was doing a routine late-night check of the passenger deck around 2 in the morning. It was quiet. Most passengers were asleep. The ship was moving through a narrow channel with no lights on either shore, just black water and the sound of the engines. Tate noticed something odd at the far end of the passenger corridor. One of the cabin doors was open, not wide open, just cracked, maybe 6 inches. He walked down to close it, standard procedure, especially in cold weather. When he reached the door, he glanced inside. The cabin was dark, but the corridor light reached far enough for him to see. The cabin was empty, bed made, no luggage, no personal items. Except there was someone sitting in the chair in the corner. Tate froze. He said the figure was completely still, sitting upright, facing the door but not looking at him, looking slightly to the left of him, just sitting, in total darkness, not moving. Tate said he stood there for what felt like a full minute before his brain told his mouth to speak. He said, "Hey, this cabin is unoccupied. Do you have a boarding pass?" Nothing. No response. No movement. He reached in and hit the light switch. The chair was empty. Tate stood in the doorway for a long time. He was not a man who scared easily. 6 years on these ferries, night runs through remote waters. He had seen strange things before. But he said this was different. He had seen that figure. He had. He was not asleep. He had not imagined it. He reported it to the night officer, and they did a full passenger count. They came up 1 short. They checked the manifest. Every passenger who had boarded in Juneau was accounted for, except for 1. A cabin booked under a name that the ticket system showed as purchased in cash at the terminal, a male name, no other identifying information. No one had seen this passenger board. No one had seen him in the common areas. The cabin had been made up by housekeeping before the voyage. There was a used towel in the bathroom and a small dent in the pillow that suggested someone had been there. The ferry was searched thoroughly, every inch, every deck, every storage area, lifeboats, engine room. They didn't find anyone. About 4 hours later, as they were approaching a small stop called Wrangell, a crew member spotted something in the water off the port side, a life preserver from the ship, and floating next to it, a single boot. They stopped. Coast Guard was notified. A search was conducted in the waters around the channel. Nothing was ever found. No body, no other items. The FBI got involved because the ticket purchase, cash, no ID, a name that turned out to match no one in any database, raised flags. Agents boarded at Ketchikan and conducted interviews with the crew. What they found, or rather didn't find, was the unsettling part. No cameras on that passenger deck captured the mystery passenger at any point during the voyage. Not boarding, not walking the corridors, not in the cabin. Nothing. The used towel and the pillow dent were the only physical evidence that anyone had occupied that cabin at all. The boot pulled from the water was a men's size 11. No brand markings, no manufacturer label, no stitching pattern that matched any known commercial boot. The FBI sent it to the lab in Quantico. The report that came back said the boot had been manufactured by hand, using materials and methods consistent with techniques from several decades prior. The case was eventually closed as inconclusive. The passenger manifest entry was flagged as a likely fraudulent booking, the boot logged as evidence, and that was that. Tate quit the ferries the following spring. He said in a personal account shared in a maritime forum years later, "I know what I saw in that chair,
And I know that whatever it was, it looked at me before the light came on, not after, before, like it knew what was coming. Story 5. The Voice on Channel 16. Channel 16 is the International Maritime Distress Frequency. If you're on a boat anywhere in the world and you need help, you call Channel 16. Every vessel is required to monitor it. The Coast Guard monitors it constantly. In the waters around Kodiak Island, some of the most brutal fishing grounds in the world, Channel 16 calls come in regularly. Mayday calls, distress signals, requests for assistance. The Coast Guard station at Kodiak handles dozens of incidents every year. But this particular call, logged in the early hours of a March morning, was different enough that it eventually ended up in an FBI file. The call came in at approximately 3:17 a.m. Coast Guard communications officer on duty, a young man named Ellis, picked it up immediately. What he heard was a voice, calm, quiet, no distress in it at all, speaking on the emergency frequency. The voice said, "I need you to stop looking." That was it. Just those 5 words once, and then silence. Ellis responded as protocol requires. He asked for the caller's vessel name and position. No response. He tried again. Nothing. He flagged it as unusual and logged it. It would have ended there, except that the call came in again 40 minutes later. Same voice, same flat, calm tone. This time it said, "There are 4 of you on this boat and none of you should be here." Ellis was alone in the communications room. He reported it immediately to his supervisor. Coast Guard reviewed the transmission logs, triangulated the signal as best they could. The call appeared to originate from a position roughly 20 miles offshore, in a section of water that, when checked against vessel tracking data, showed no registered boats. 2 days later, a commercial crab boat called the Marjorie Jean reported something unusual on their way back into Kodiak Harbor. The crew had been out for 4 days. On their last night, around 2 a.m., their own radio had come alive on Channel 16, unprompted, nobody touching it. A voice, they described it the same way Ellis did, calm, flat, like someone reading from a list, had said, "You found something that wasn't yours to find. Put it back." The captain of the Marjorie Jean, a veteran fisherman named Lou, had been spooked enough to make a report when he got to harbor. When the Coast Guard cross-referenced the timestamp, it matched a third Channel 16 anomaly they had logged from another vessel that same night. 3 separate boats, 3 separate incidents, same voice, same channel, over the span of roughly 10 days. The Coast Guard referred the matter to the FBI because the transmissions were interfering with emergency communications and because there was no identifiable source. FBI technical analysts spent several weeks on the recordings. They isolated the voice, ran it through analysis. What they found was strange. The voice had characteristics, acoustic properties in the way it produced certain vowel sounds that were inconsistent with normal human speech. Not robotic, not synthesized, just subtly wrong in ways that were hard to pin down. One analyst wrote in her notes, "The voice presents as adult male, approximately 40 to 60 years of age. However, several phonetic markers are anomalous. The breath pattern is absent. Over several minutes of audio, the speaker does not take a breath." No source was ever identified. The transmissions stopped as suddenly as they started. No vessel was ever linked to the calls. No equipment was found. Lou, the captain of the Marjorie Jean, was asked in his interview what he thought it was. He was quiet for a moment, and then said, "Something out there knows we're on the water, and it doesn't like it." Story 6. The Hunters Who Didn't Come Back. Every fall, hunters fly into the Alaskan bush. Charter planes drop them off in remote river valleys, and they spend a week or two hunting caribou, moose, bear. It's a tradition, a big industry, and every year a handful of hunters don't make it out. Some are accidents, some are weather, some are animal encounters, and some are things nobody can explain. In September, 2 hunters flew into a valley in the Brooks Range, about 200 miles north of Fairbanks. Their names were Greg and Nolan, lifelong friends, both experienced hunters in their early 40s. They had done this trip before, multiple times. Their charter pilot, a woman named Diane, dropped them at a gravel bar on the river and arranged to pick them up in 10 days. 10 days later, Diane flew back in. The camp was there, the tent, the gear, the food, all of it, mostly untouched. The fire pit had ash from several days prior, meaning they had been there for at least a few days before something changed. Their rifles were propped against the tent, their backpacks were inside, their boots were lined up outside the tent door. Greg and Nolan were gone. Diane radioed for help and circled the area. She could see for miles in every direction. Open tundra, gravel bars, the river winding south. Nobody. Alaska State Troopers responded by helicopter within hours. FBI was notified due to the remote location and the unusual circumstances. Agent Harmon, who took the lead, had worked multiple missing hunter cases in Alaska. He said this one immediately felt different. The first thing that struck the team was the food. Despite 8 days presumably passing, most of their food supply was untouched. Hunters in that country burn enormous calories. These 2 men had barely eaten anything after day 2. The second thing was the journal. Greg kept a hunting journal. Not unusual, many hunters do. It was found inside his sleeping bag. Harmon read it on site that first day. He said he read it 3 times because he couldn't make sense of it. The first 3 entries were normal: weather, game sightings, camp notes, but entry 4 was different in tone. Greg wrote that they had heard something in the hills above their camp the second night. He described it as a sound like someone dragging something heavy across rock. It went on for a long time, far longer than any natural source he could think of. Entry 5. Nolan saw it on the ridge. Dark, too tall, moving wrong. We didn't go out today. Entry 6. It was at the river last night, standing in the water, facing us. We watched it from the tent for 2 hours. It did not move once, not once. When dawn came, it was gone. Entry 7, the last entry, was just 4 words. It wants us separate. That was the final thing Greg wrote. Search teams covered the valley for 11 days. Helicopters, dogs, foot teams. They found no human remains, no further camps, no signs of travel in either direction. What they found instead on the 8th day of searching was a series of marks on the rock face above the camp, carved in, not scratched, actually carved deep in a long diagonal line along a section of cliff about 30 feet above the valley floor. The marks were not letters, not any symbols from any known writing system, but they were arranged in a deliberate, repeating pattern. An archaeologist brought in to evaluate them said she had never seen anything like it. Her assessment was that the marks were recent, weeks old at most, and that the tool used to make them had produced a cut depth that would have required significant force on solid granite. No tool was found. No explanation was found. Greg and Nolan were never found. Agent Harmon worked the case for 2 years before it went inactive.
In his final case summary, in the section for investigator observations, he wrote, "This investigation produced more questions than answers. The physical evidence does not support any conventional explanation for the disappearance of these two men. I am closing this case without resolution and with significant unease."
Story 7. The Thing That Followed Agent Cole Home. I want to end tonight with a story that is a little different from the others, because this one isn't about a victim. This one is about an FBI agent, a man named Cole, who spent 11 years working out of the Anchorage field office, specializing in crimes in remote and rural Alaska. He has since retired and moved out of state, and he agreed to have his story told, but not his full name and not the specific location of the case that started all of it. He spent 11 years looking into what he called the darker cases, not crimes in the traditional sense, not murder investigations or fraud cases. He worked the cases that didn't fit, missing persons in impossible circumstances, unexplained events reported by bush pilots and fishing crews, incidents in native communities that touched on things far older than anything the FBI was designed to deal with. After 11 years of that, Cole said something started following him. He described it carefully, calmly, the way a man who has trained himself to observe describes things. He said it started small, a feeling of being watched in his apartment, finding the same word, a word he had seen at a case site carved into a post, appearing in his own handwriting in his own notebooks, even when he had no memory of writing it. Then one night, he woke up at 3 a.m. to the sound of someone sitting in the chair in the corner of his bedroom. He said he lay still, the way he had been trained to do. He listened. The chair was an old wooden one. It creaked when you sat in it. It was creaking softly, rhythmically, the way it would if someone was in it, breathing. He reached for his sidearm on the nightstand, turned on the light, and the room was empty. But the chair was rocking. Cole told this story to a colleague, a fellow agent who he trusted. The colleague didn't dismiss it. Instead, he told Cole something that Cole had not known, that 2 other agents who had worked the same type of remote, unexplained cases in Alaska had reported similar experiences after extended fieldwork in certain areas. One had transferred, one had retired early. Cole filed an informal report, not official, just for his own records, documenting the incidents. He continued to work his cases. He said he tried to rationalize it, to put a box around it the way investigators are trained to do. But then, one evening, he came home to his apartment and found his front door unlocked. He was certain he had locked it. He drew his weapon and cleared the apartment room by room. Everything was in place, nothing taken, nothing moved. Except on the kitchen table, there was a piece of paper, a printout, a photograph from one of his case files, a picture of a remote valley in the interior where he had worked a particularly unsettling missing persons case the previous summer, a place he had not been able to stop thinking about. Someone had printed it from his own printer, his own case files, and left it on his table. Cole's computer forensics team examined his laptop and found no unauthorized access. His printer's memory showed no print jobs from that time. The paper existed. The image was real. There was no explanation for how it had gotten there. Cole requested a transfer 6 months later. His request was quietly approved. On his last day in Anchorage, he drove out to the edge of the city, to the point where the road ends and the wilderness begins, and he sat there for a while, looking out at the dark line of trees. He said he had the distinct feeling that something out there was watching him go, and that it was not happy about it. He said, "You work cases like these long enough, and you start to understand that Alaska isn't just a place, it's a presence, and some of what lives in it doesn't like being looked at, doesn't like being named, doesn't like being documented in an FBI case file." He paused. But mostly, it doesn't like being forgotten. Those were 7 true scary Alaska FBI horror stories. 7 cases that came out of one of the most remote, mysterious places on Earth. A place where the wilderness swallows things whole. People, evidence, explanations. A place where the darkness is real and it is deep, and it doesn't always give back what it takes. If you made it all the way to the end, thank you for being here. If any of these stories connected to something you've experienced, something unexplained, something that happened somewhere remote and cold, you can send it in. Because the truth is, these cases don't stop. The files keep growing, and Alaska keeps its secrets. Stay safe out there, and remember, if you're ever somewhere dark and isolated, and you get that feeling that something is watching you, don't look toward the trees. Whatever is looking back at you is counting on you to do exactly that. Good night.